The frogs, for me, were one of my most powerful and, I guess, memorable introductions to nature, in part because I cut my teeth, so to speak, got my feet wet in what remnants of water remained in the San Fernando Valley where I was a kid until I was 17, and then I came up here to the university to go to school. But there was enough of the LA River remaining that we would go out and fish for that or fish for this, never knowing that there were a few fish that were edible in it. But we were little kids and it was safe, and frogs were part of that environment. But not a prominent part until an event back in Michigan, probably within the same time range of being a 7 or 8 year old. Going back and going out with my two uncles when we had a family reunion, because my mother and father were both from the Midwest in Michigan. And one of the aunts had a lakeside cabin big enough to bring in, I guess, as I recall, probably 12, 16 members of the immediate family. And the two uncles and I would go out for frogs. The thought being that we were going to eat bullfrogs. And they're inedible, as you may or may not know, because they have these, like frogs do, and toads do too, these prodigious thighs on them to catapult them into space, or in the case of a toad, to hop very close to the ground rather than jump like frogs do. One of the distinctions between frogs and toads is their muscularity and a certain amount of anatomy making a distinction. Otherwise, they're very closely related and go through metamorphosis stages in identical ways in several circumstances that are also identical. Apart from that, we're out in the boat, drifting at night. All the aunts are back at the cabin. We're far enough away we don't hear anybody, and we start scouting for bullfrogs. And this is a pretty intense kind of experience for a 7-year-old kid, holding the flashlight and watch for the eyes. And sure enough, here are the eyes just above the surface of the water. And you see them, and then the uncle would come around, and he said, here's the way you do it. And pop his hand down, grab it just behind the forelegs, and put it in a sack. And now it's your turn. So I think I caught maybe one, and my uncles caught 3 or 4 of them. And he said, well, now we have enough, let's go back to the cabin. Well, the adventure was only starting. Well, it started for me and wasn't quite over yet, but more adventure was about to come, because my two uncles, being rascals, unlike me, would never do anything like this, very stealthily went upstairs and slipped the frogs into my aunt's beds. So here are these 2 bullfrogs in the 2 aunts, and they go upstairs to bed, and we're all waiting in anticipation, and I don't recall that the uncles were, holding their hands tensely. And then suddenly these high-pitched screams came almost simultaneously, where they pulled it back, and here's a bullfrog. And they were all alive in the middle of the bed. So that particular hijinks with frogs wasn't, they were released, by the way, back to the lake, was indelible in my memory, along with another occasion back in the Michigan woods of watching a bullfrog popping from pond to pond. And they're big, and they'll get to be 8 pounds, by the way. And when you see them, they look like a rabbit because of their hops and the degree that they can cover the ground. And right behind it was a bull snake, probably about 5.5 or 6 feet, coming full tilt. And snakes, as you may know, if you've seen them in the field, can move pretty darn fast. And the frog is doing everything it can to get out of range. And here comes the snake. Didn't see me until it practically was at my feet, looked up, and made a right-hand turn to get out of harm's way as far as the snake was concerned. But after that, it was pretty much focusing from nature on the ground to focusing to nature largely in the trees and surrounding me, in birds and even mammals that were fascinating. But I have to say, coming back to this book was and continues to be an extraordinary expanse of my understanding and appreciation of nature because of the subtlety and the power that these individual species have within their very minute and complex ecosystems. As we know, those ecosystems are collapsing for any number of reasons, not the least of which is climate change, environmental impact, indifference, what it might be. And as that happens, the role that these species can play is gone. And the degree to which that whole ecosystem benefits from their presence is not just diminished, it's absent. And to be able to do the book and to have a fine writer like Marty Crum, who I think is an excellent writer on nature, compose these stories about it. So you're right there, and you're right moving through the time of day that these frogs are particularly active. And on an episode of adventure, gives us a depth and a footing and a feeling that I think is pretty special. I'm going to try to give you a couple of highlights about some of the species here and point them out. I'm not going to go to each one because I can't do full justice to each one like Crum's book does. But the aspect of their diversity and their strategies for survival, I think, are worth mentioning right from the get-go. The first one I'm going to talk about is not even on the wall here, but it's on the basically the first page of the Frog Day book, and not the first page, but pretty close to it. And it's the golden poison frog. And of course, having said that, it's not on the first page. This particular species is depicted practically coming off, and you can see it right around the corner when we finish here, practically coming out of the page in your direction. And the collaboration that I was talking about earlier with some of you between the writer and the artist made this, I think, for me, a very special experience because we could give and take information, and I would compose into the drawing the emphasis that was being given or about to be given in describing that particular species. So the golden frog looks at you like, well, what are you all about? I'm not afraid of you, and treats you in the field just like you're no threat at all. Because anyone with an experience in that area knows that the golden poison frog is one of the most toxic species on the face of the earth. And as Marty describes it, and I'm not going to get into the reading of it, a small fraction of an ounce is enough to kill 10 people in just a matter of minutes because of the toxicity and the way it shuts down the whole system and the heart stops. Well, the frog accumulates that poison, as is described, by what it eats. And if it doesn't have that diet that incorporates the poison into the system, the skin is not excreting that poison out of the frog's body, and it's otherwise non-toxic. So what the native people in Central America have discovered is, I'm talking thousands of years back likely, is that if they roll the tip of their spears against the skin of the frog, the golden frog, it was sufficient to provide that toxic impact of taking something out of the tree using a blowgun dart or an arrow from a bow in just a matter of seconds, because it would be hit, lose consciousness, and fall from the tree. And to this day, it's still being employed in that fashion, carefully. Well, let's kind of go around here for a minute. And the frog I had alluded to earlier over here, the wood frog is one of the species of frogs that is native to North America. And it's exceptional because if you follow the narrative, you can go through and discover that This is a frog that endures the winters by being partially frozen for 3 or 4 or more months. And it's frozen along within the waterway, but has a equivalent of a relief that keeps the vital organs still functioning, the heart and the lungs, while the outer portions of the frog's body are essentially rock solid, but not impacted to the degree that they would in, say, a human, where you'd have some deterioration or some impact on the muscles. And then with the thaw, you get the frog coming around and immediately goes back into the pond and sets up its life cycle through courtship and then finding the mate, providing a place for the tadpoles and the embryos to develop, and then again getting ready for winter again. But the sequencing there demonstrates, I think, the incredible evolution of some of these species to match the degree of the habitat. You go to the tropics, they don't have winters, but they have other situations that are challenging as well. So the frogs adapt. By the way, that one to the left of the frog I've just discussed that's leaping up at the heron is a bullfrog, an African bullfrog. And the African bullfrog has been brought into this country and it's expanded its range, and boy, it's quite basically carnivorous of other frogs as well. But it's the only frog that has teeth. So my job, after I discovered that it's not toothless, it's toothsome, is to demonstrate the aggressiveness, because like so many of these other frogs, the males don't simply impregnate or fertilize the eggs. They have principal roles to carry out for the survival of the species. And in this case, here's a bullfrog leaping at a night heron, which is native to Africa too, fortunately, because I had a native night heron to use in the drawing, and so on and so forth. Here's a male frog that Darwin discovered, and when they studied it, they realized that the male frog took the embryos into the sacs at the edge of its throat, and there is where your polywog is incubated to the point of maturity. And then when they're ready to go, the father goes out at a proper place, not always in the same place because he can distribute the youngsters somewhere, and opens his mouth and out they jump. Down in the tropics, where there's no shortage of water, there's a lot of noise, and we know that frogs require being heard in order to attract a mate. Well, the strategy around waterfalls, where nothing can be heard but the falling water, over here is what would be flagging crow, back on crows before I knew it, flagging frog using the foot to attract the attention of the female. And they're still studying, is it the frequency of the foot? Is it the orchestration that goes with it along the fancy movement? But in any event, planting itself out there using the foot to attract because it can't be heard. Not all the frogs have I guess what you'd call a career that's a happy or admirable one. The crane toad pictured here is one that was brought in particularly to Australia because they wanted to combat some of the insects that had invaded their crop areas. And the crane frog was well known to consume anything in its path. And it did, but not the insects, and ate the other frogs. So wherever it's been brought in or expanded, then it's become detrimental to the quality of that environment. The other source, rather than bringing it in like we see examples, especially in some of the isolated islands, well, let's bring in a predator to stop the snakes from eating the bird life. And in the case of the frogs, they're often taken from pet stores. People don't know if they can continue to take care of them, so they release them into an environment, figuring they'll do okay. Well, they not only do okay, but they do a lot of damage. And the crane frog is not the only one. Well, as I mentioned, the example again and again of the males playing an important role in the whole process. This mud nesting frog is fascinating because of the elaborate mud nest that it constructs over a period of time. And you can take a look at that construction and you realize pretty quickly that it's not something that's done overnight. But there's quite a commitment in a proper place, and then to advertise, it'll pop its head out, keeping an eye out for a possible female out there somewhere, and croak and bark and do whatever it's doing. And it will, in fact, then invite the female to the mud nest. She makes an examination of it. And I have not witnessed it, but Marty Crum has. And she says, they don't always like the nest. And they'll hop off and go in another direction. And this mud nesting effort by the male is for naught at that point. But it continues to persist and eventually gets a female. Here's another example of an effort. This land frog will accompany the young frogs after they emerge from the polywog stage by loading them on his back. And he will then distribute them over an area, say 50 square meters from the pond itself. And it may take a week before all of them eventually jettison themselves from the back of the male frog. But that's a way in which there's not a saturation of all the frogs in one area, and they lose, of course, a number of them because of that saturation. In this case, distribution works to the benefit of all. And the male is the bus ride that they pursue in order to get to those spots. In this case, this male carries the eggs from once they're laid onto his back and attached all the way to completion, and then eventually delivers them into an aquatic area. But that particular one from Europe is found in oak forests and toting along those big packets of eggs to distribute in various locations so that they can mature eventually into polywogs and then frogs themselves. The structure of the frogs themselves, and I think the Darwin frog is an example because of the structure of the mouth itself and the accommodation along the glands of the throat to raise the youngsters before they're jumping out of his mouth. But the structure of this wedge-headed frog is such that when it retreats back into its hollow, this is a tree frog, it indeed can't be extracted because a predatory, it could be, I suppose it could be a large bird, might grab it by the top of the head, which is reinforced with a very thick bony plate, and try to pull it out. But when you look at the wedge, it could only get so far out before it's stuck right there at the entry to that hollow and doesn't go any further. So you've got a good example of this range of structure, behavior, habits, and so on and so forth to accommodate the survival and the persistence of the species. Let me come around here to the other, hang on a second, I wanted to see if it's over on this other side. No, the one I wanted to mention, and then I'm going to kind of randomly respond to, oh yeah, thank you, yeah, not too far away. One I wanted to mention in particular was what we were talking about as the symbiotic relationship. This humming frog down here in the lower right-hand corner is extraordinarily unique in teaming up with a totally unrelated species, an insect, to its own benefit and the benefit of the tarantula. And up until probably maybe a century ago, we weren't sure how various communications were going on other than the frogs croaking back and forth to one another, but how they could recognize individuals, and good part of it is scent and even taste. They can identify individuals in a way that sensory part of their body is really highly tuned. And the tarantula has an appetite for all kinds of frogs, small ones, but not this particular humming frog, because its behavior is suitable to the tarantula's nest. The number, I guess there have been sometimes half a dozen of the tiny humming frogs, which are very, very small, no bigger than that as adults, just up the top end of my little finger. And they will burrow down, actually pushing the tarantula's forelegs out of the way to get down into the nest and settle in for the day. And then at night, they come out, or the time of day that the most active for the tarantula, and settle in right beneath the tarantula, kind of watching for ants that would otherwise invade the tarantula's nest and eat the young ants, or eat the young tarantula, or feed on the eggs of the tarantula. And then, in turn, the tarantula seizes and discourages any predators that might attack the frog. This particular tree frog is like, I suppose all of them, as I said earlier, are unique, but this one struck me as being most unique. This is a marsupial tree frog. And in this case, the male will fertilize the eggs and then deposit them in the sacs on the back, like kangaroos that have them on the lower belly, into the sacs on the back of the female. And she will carry them to maturity, and at that point of maturity, the young frogs jump out and they're on their own. I asked Marty Crum when we were doing this, and I said this is collaborative, I said, God, this frog and doing the research on it, which again has been terrific because of what the internet is able to provide in the way of film and reference material, and of course the narratives that go with it in the background, very accessible, which made it easy for me to get. And but I noticed that I kept running into these males that were so fascinating in their form. Not that the females weren't, because there's the important part of that whole story, those backpacks she takes around in the trees. But I said, well, after the male inserts the eggs in the sacs of the female's back, I said, do they still hang out with one another? Because I'd like to feature them, including the male. And she said, no, I'm sorry to tell you that the female will have nothing to do with him after he does business. And I said, okay. So what you see here is my attempt to show a very sad male way off to the side, and the female looking confident and aloof and safe and everything else. But it has both of them in there. But I looked at them and thought to myself, what a terrific collection of opportunities to design, ideas in pen and ink, and put these ideas in and collaborate to make the point that the narrative also makes. Well, this may be next to the last that I'll mention, but pitcher plants, which we know are carnivorous. Here again is a story, and this particular frog is, if not the smallest, among the smallest of any vertebrate on Earth. They're no bigger than that as mature. And what they do is go to these particular pitcher plants that are not, as we might think, carnivorous, but tend to eat vegetable material. And the pair will go down into the pitcher plant material and liquid, and it's there that they will lay their eggs and raise their young, which then can operate on their egg sac until they're mature enough to clamber up the insides of the pitcher plant and then be out on their own. But you look, I think, at every one of these arrangements, and they're set in, and you're reminded of, I hope, the interdependency between place and other life for the survival of one another, and the degree to which you have frogs taking various elements within the tree canopy that they move around in and depositing or distributing, whether it's seeds or pollination, whatever it is, just like hummingbirds can do that in flowers, and bees obviously do. We're just beginning to discover. So that collaborative, subtle, non-written, non-discussed, but way out there to give us a better understanding of the world. I think frogs embrace it in a way that I had never quite known about, certainly before, and the degree to which it's done, I'm even more appreciative because of all that we need to know more of that's out there.